let's move on to Ross Ulbricht and the story of the Silk Road.
We've had a lot of laughs.
just
Obviously
going
it's
back
a
and
dark
forth.
story in many ways.
Yep.
There's sort of this bright spot now with him being pardoned. We'll wait till the end to talk about whether or not we agree with that decision. Not that it's on our, not that we like to comment on politics,
Yeah.
but yeah, there's so many just insane aspects of this story.
Yeah.
And I think that as we looked into it, we realized that so many people had talked about the history and the sort of crime story around Silk Road because it's so fascinating. It's this internet narco trafficker meets hacker meets Anon who, was an Eagle Scout, right? So it's this like wild story.
Yeah, we should.
And an amazing marketer,
Oh, yeah.
even after getting caught.
Even after, he still has a ton of fans. I don't know if, Ben, you can pull this photo up, but he was an Eagle Scout. I was an Eagle Scout. Did you know
Really?
that? Yeah.
I didn't know that. My dad was an Eagle Scout.
And I remember when I was in the Boy Scouts, they would tell everyone, no Eagle Scout has ever been convicted of a felony or something like that. And it was like clearly wrong, but it was just to like put you in the mindset of like, well, I don't want to be the first one, so I can't be a criminal.
Yeah.
And it was very effective.
The Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts fell off massively.
There are tons of like culture war issues there.
Yeah. And real,
like,
issues around
criminal
sex
stuff.
crimes and stuff like that. But anyway,
but he has a lot of fans, and
dude.
Dripped Out Technology Brothers like really, really likes him and has posted him multiple times. There's another photo of him. We'll put that up on the screen of him. And
without a doubt, he's benefited massively from his aesthetics.
Yeah,
and,
the physiognomy is strong.
which is why it's underpriced to get diced.
I don't know that he's diced. I don't know that he's actually
diced,
lifting.
But a lot of people say
see.
he looks healthier than
healthy.
Brian Johnson. After 11 years in prison, eating prison slop.
Yeah. What's the secret?
What's the secret?
Yeah.
We'll have to ask him.
He does look young, and he's certainly played into that, and we'll go into kind of the timeline here because a lot of people think, he was 17 when he did this. Wrong.
The other aspect that we'll talk about throughout the story is how good of a marketer he was. And he and his family, post-incarceration, on his carceral journey, they were able to spin this story like he was like some 18-year-old kid, a high schooler almost. What you'll find out is that he was, 11 years ago, when he was put into prison, he was 29 years old.
Yeah.
So he wasn't a kid.
No,
right?
not at all. He was born in 1984.
And he was very aware of his actions. So just to get into kind of like the high level founder mode elements of the story, and then we'll get into the timeline. He's a self-taught developer, first-time CEO, completely bootstrapped the company, went from 0 to 1.2 billion in sales in less than 3 years, personally netted over 80 million in fees off the marketplace with a very low take rate, which we'll also get into, operating a fully remote, global, and basically anonymous team where he was the only one that knew the real identity of his employees. He would require them to show ID, leveraged novel payment rails using Bitcoin, and maintain this sort of missionary sort of mode to building the company that was basically almost like a religious pursuit for him because of his libertarian beliefs, which we'll also get into.
And so the backbone of our research was mostly Nick Bilton's American Kingpin, which is a great book. I highly recommend it. It reads like, it's a page turner. It's like a total thriller. And so Bilton kicks it off by taking you back to the beginning of Ross Ulbricht's story. Born in Austin, Texas, March 27th, 1984. Supportive middle-class household, nothing crazy going on. Eagle Scout, as we mentioned. Friends and family described him as polite, gentile, and unassuming. Ulbricht developed an interest in science, tinkering with computers. He goes to University of Texas at Dallas on scholarship, initially studying physics. Then he pursues a master's degree in material science at Penn State. And he basically gets obsessed with libertarian economic theory, especially Ludwig von Mises, Murray Rothbard, and Milton Friedman.
Yeah, and so while he's there, so one thing to note, he's not studying computer science. He's not a programmer at all at this point. He's interested in technology, but he's spending his time going and debating libertarian beliefs, arguing for things like the legalization of drugs. His big point, the high level sort of his high level view is that the government should not have any decision making power over individuals, and individuals should be able to do whatever they want. And he goes on to do whatever he wants. For the basically.
Have you seen that post?
Part.
It should go on Banger Archive, but it's like women will say they want a man who reads, but every man who reads ascribes to some scaring extremist political belief. And it's like, he got into reading and started reading like Mises and Rothbard and like these like kind of crazy philosophers. And he really,
speaking of Ludwig von Mises, there's this UFC fighter Money Moicano. He's done this post-fight speech where he just is like hammering against the government. Being like,
and I mean, obviously, like there's a lot of good ideas in libertarianism, but it clearly like Ross took it to such an extreme that he was using it to justify anything, and clearly bending his like libertarians love to they have a hammer and everything looks like a nail, and so they wind up not seeing any externalities, just viewing every little minor interaction as like, oh well, this fits with my libertarian ideology, so therefore it's justified. And he really twisted the ideology in like a much more negative way than many libertarians who are just arguing for like slightly smaller government or like, slightly, lower taxes or something, or more efficiency in the government. Like you could look at Doge as like a libertarian project in some ways, but it's much different than, we should legalize guns and drugs and all this crazy stuff, which is like where he wound up. And so,
not just legalizing it, but brokering transactions at scale for a number of illicit goods.
He dabbled in entrepreneurial ventures after graduate school. One of these involved day trading. Another was an ebook enterprise. None proved lucrative or fulfilling.
So to be clear, he was trying to do day trading, realized it wasn't very profitable. He also he was a part of this someone else's sort of nonprofit called Good Wagon Books, which they would go around to houses, collect sort of old books that people didn't want. They would sell the ones online that they could, and then they would donate to prisons the ones that they couldn't sell.
Wow.
And so he was probably donating books to himself in his later years.
Setting himself up.
And one other thing about this time that I thought was interesting, while at Penn State, little like odd jobs he was working, he saved up enough to buy a rental house. And he later shared that he found it so frustrating having college students as degenerate college students as tenants that he sold it. And he actually used that money to kind of get Silk Road off the ground because he didn't have an income for some amount of time.
Yeah. So he becomes fascinated with Tor, the onion router, which is the portal to the dark web.
The timing here is so key, right?
Yeah,
because like if he had all these ideas 5 years before, tried to do it then, wouldn't have had Bitcoin. I don't know where Tor was in the development, but it wasn't. All this stuff was like this perfect convergence.
Totally. And Bitcoin obviously coming up at this time. Few people outside of cryptography circles were paying attention to Bitcoin, but Ross saw it as a tool for circumventing government oversight. He once famously stated, "I want to use economic theory as a means to abolish the use of coercion." This quote illustrates Ross's self-styled mission of empowering voluntary exchanges. And it's also very funny throughout this because he's not like super technical. There's a lot of times when clearly you can tell that he's bought, like, oh, nothing can go wrong. It's decentralized. Like, Bitcoin, it's anonymous. And it's like, it's actually not anonymous, like in many ways. And there's always ways around this stuff.
You don't have to, but what's the word for it? You don't have to KYC.
Yeah.
But it's a public ledger.
Exactly. So it's very, very traceable. And we'll go into this later, but they're like tracking the Bitcoin movements actually got a lot more people caught because it was all trackable. And there's
still companies today like Chainalysis that leverage public blockchains to track down criminals at scale.
Yeah. And so combining Tor with Bitcoin and his ideological calling, he sets up the first version of the Silk Road. By early 2011, Silk Road was online, though still small, and his site allowed buyers and sellers to communicate, post product listing, and leave reviews. This is basically an eBay clone.
Yeah, and so just going back a little bit, taking one quick break. Sure. So to anytime you're starting a marketplace. So the fact that he took this marketplace from 0 to 1.2 billion in volume in 3 years, bootstrapped, is insane. Like very, very, very few companies do that. In order to get this started, marketplaces have this chicken and egg problem where what comes first, the supply you need supply in order to have demand on the marketplace. And so he actually starts growing mushrooms in order to create the supply to have supply on the marketplace. So he's growing mushrooms, he's building the site, and then once he's at a point where he's ready, and he has a girlfriend at this time who's like, sounds like a very sweet girl, and they're very like in love at the time. And he at one point like takes his girlfriend like blindfolded out to like see the mushrooms, and like is like all proud of it, like takes her out to this like damp kind of field or whatever, and there's just, and so he's this is like the very beginning of him actually. So he had the intention to commit crimes, and he's very aware that it's what he's doing is illegal, and he specifically chose psilocybin mushrooms because he felt like the penalty for that would be less severe than starting by selling harder drugs. Heroin. Or even something like marijuana at the time.
But I thought the amount that he was growing it wasn't like he was growing like, oh, he's got like one little plant. It was like a whole room full, and the punishment for that if he had gotten caught would have been years and years in prison just for that. Which is like still kind of crazy.
And one thing is, in order to kind of kickstart the first initial sales, he went on a site that would talk a public forum that would talk about mushrooms, and he made a post. And he was very this was smart at the time if you weren't committing crimes, but he posted something under this username. I forget what the username was called.
Was it Altoid?
It was Altoid. And it was like, hey, has anybody tried this site?
Yeah, it looks pretty cool.
Looks cool. And he used that to sort of catalyze some traction because he knew he was holding supply that he was ready to sell. And so we'll get to this later, but that ended up being part of his downfall because he had used his real email to create the Altoid account. And he had gone back at one point and changed the email, but there was a record in the database that it had rossulbricht@gmail.com tied to that username. So that was one of the ways that they sort of ended up
he's one of those things where he's like, oh, everything's anonymized and decentralized. It's like, you left paper trail all over the place, bro. Like, you were not that good at your OPSEC. And so it's fascinating how fast this took off. So he's thinking about it in late 2010. In January of 2011, he launches the Silk Road, codenamed Underground Brokers, in Austin, Texas, aiming to create a free market website where users can buy anything anonymously. And by June, just 6 months later, Senator Chuck Schumer denounces Silk Road in Washington, D.C., prompting heightened media coverage that forces Ross to bolter.
They also got a big Gawker article, which I think was right around this time.
This all happened right around the same time.
Schumer, so a reporter who was at Gawker, and Gawker's no longer with us due to the actions of some powerful people in tech. But this Gawker article hears about Silk Road, gets on it, and is browsing around, ends up writing this whole piece. Ross talks to them and says, please don't write this piece. That usually doesn't work with journalists. They know they're onto something. They end up publishing this. And there was even a while that journalist was suspected of starting Silk Road because it was such a big marketing moment that people were like, did he just like
start this?
Did he like use this? And he'd written about some other topics.
There were
and that was like Ross really felt like it was too early for it to go that public. Like they were starting to do sales in a meaningful way, but at the same time, he was a self-taught developer, and so he struggled with hacks and stuff like that all the time. And so he would notice every now and then, he'd be like, oh, what the heck? Like my wallet's getting drained. And so he'd be freaking out. The Bitcoin at the time, to be clear, we should look up on public what the actual price was, but it would be like, I'm sure it was like a few dollars.
It was a few dollars,
Bitcoin. And so he'd be noticing like, oh, my wallet's getting drained. It wasn't that damaging, but he kept having these sort of small errors because he was not a super sophisticated. He was like a hacker type builder, but not a security engineer. And so he kept constantly getting kind of lightly scammed. And so this launch, like you can imagine, he's just in Austin building this thing by himself. He had a couple engineers that would help him that knew they were committing crimes too, but they were on board with it. And then going 0 to 60 in 6 months, 0 to 100, 0 to 1,000, right? Like he's getting a senator in Washington, D.C. that's denouncing you. Is the pressure was on right away.
Usually these like, government federal level pressures take like years until like the first like, oh, is Facebook leading to misinformation that took like, years and years, or even like the Juul
probably
hearings.
almost 10 years.
Yeah. The Juul hearings were probably, that company was started like 10 years before.
And they was being publicly marketed the whole time.
Yeah, totally.
Silk Road had the Gawker article and some other coverage, but it wasn't.
Yeah. Chuck Schumer had the Zinn press conference in 2024. Zinn launched in America 2014. And so the dark web, Amazon, the Silk Road really like just took off so fast, 6 months.
And to be clear, the reasons why it was in many ways a much better, looking purely at the user experience. If somebody that's buying drugs in 2011, while this starts, they can go and find a dealer on the street or hit up some random sketchy person on Facebook. And there's all these ways to have a transaction that don't have a bunch of reviews, right? So you're kind of trusting the dealer, which is like people that sell drugs. I can imagine you wouldn't want to like trust them with your life. And so the experience at the time was from a purely like a product experience, to be able to go on a site to see vetted sellers that have a selling history and activity on the forum and reviews. He really made the experience of buying these narcotics much better. And people were allowed to buy very small amounts. And this ended up being what slowly helped get the marketplace taken down. Is it usually authorities, so like Homeland Security, DEA, FBI, when they're tracking drugs, they're looking for these big shipments. And as Silk Road started taking off, they started getting these envelopes that would be, one little pill. So like one person who just like goes on there, they just order one. It's kind of cute. It's kind of cute. But yeah, it can't be understated. Like going back to the founder story bit, he made the experience, like he really innovated on the experience.
There's a couple other things that were pretty innovative here. They had an escrow system which used Bitcoin, kind of smart contracts, but really just it would transfer the Bitcoin out of the buyer's account into a holding account, and then once the transaction cleared, it would get paid to the seller. And so like if you got scammed, you could actually have like a dispute resolution process.
It was like a PayPal type experience.
And PayPal really unlocked
and to be
eBay.
clear, so that it wasn't fully trustless, right?
No.
Like somebody
very
could have received it. It was centralized.
And we saw
Ross
that because everyone was stealing Bitcoin from the site constantly.
Well, and Ross would also have to get involved with these disputes. And there was even situations where he'd be negotiating with cartels saying, somebody would steal and the cartels would get mad at him and be threatening him. So one thing to be clear, at every step of the way, he was doing things that didn't scale. And that involved committing crimes, basically. And so looking at, and just to compare this to another company like Airbnb that got launched out of this era, Airbnb innovated on the vacation rental because there were some marketplaces, but
couch surfing.
People would book a vacation rental without seeing any reviews, and then you show up there and just like, well, the toilets don't work and the sheets are all dirty. It's a very, very similar experience. We're just opening it up and creating more trust, really catalyze some velocity.
And so as he's growing the site, he starts going by his pseudonym, the Dread Pirate Roberts, which is a
reference to the
Princess Bride. Which is like kind of an odd reference. I don't think of that as like particularly libertarian. It's just kind of like a funny, weird thing to pick because he likes that movie. Really shows you how old he is though, because that movie came out in like the 80s, right?
It's like a classic though.
And
he went and he never went by Ross, to be clear. He went by Admin.
Oh, okay.
And so going by Dread Pirate Roberts was a way to build this brand world around the site, right? It was this pirates themed kind of
it's funny because there's another pirate themed, like decentralized, like the Pirate Bay. Are you familiar with this? It's like a BitTorrent, right? So like for downloading illegal movies and stuff, much less harmful, but still kind of similar piracy theme.
Pirates of the internet.
And so people start obsessing over this guy. They revere DPR as a benevolent philosopher king who is giving the world a safer alternative to street drugs. And people really believe the narrative of like harm reduction, that he, reduced the amount of violent crime, because anytime that there's a drug transaction on the street, there's a chance it goes south and someone gets shot or stabbed or murdered or something like that. And that's not going to happen on the Silk Road. Now, the problem is that, well, if you're increasing the amount of drug dealing by 1,000x, even if they're 50% safer, well, there's still a net negative impact of that. Yeah. And you need to measure that. And so, sure, it's like,
and there
I'm sure a lot of cartels were like, cool, I'll just go on Silk Road, buy a bunch of stuff, and then deal it on the street. And so you just wind up with more street deals.
Yeah, and at this time, this brand world building that he's doing, this is why, if you view him purely as a founder and ignore the heinous crimes that he committed over a long period of time, he would do things like they would have a 420 sale, right? Where it was like whoever, if you bought on the site, you got like a ticket that entered you into something where you could win like an all expenses paid trip and stuff like that. So he was following the sort of like traditional e-commerce marketing
he's doing
method.
Black Friday, Cyber Monday is like huge for him. He's like, let's pump
and he would be like, no fees today on the platform, buy as many drugs as you want. But meanwhile, the dark side of that is that people would be buying heroin and overdosing and killing. Like
it's bad.
It was very to him. He had these libertarian ideals. Meanwhile, you're enabling addicts to, if you make it almost as easy to buy drugs as going on Amazon, you're enabling a lot of behavior that isn't so great.
And I mean, another factor of the growth was that Silk Road really drove early adoption of Bitcoin, and it created this crazy flywheel where you would buy a little bit of Bitcoin to go on Silk Road, buy some psilocybin mushrooms or something, and then because there was so much buying pressure, the price of Bitcoin would go up. You'd still have some left over in your wallet and be like, whoa, I made money, like I could buy more now, and then that would drive more people into it. And so it became this like virtuous cycle. And I remember reading about some journalists who had tested the site and bought like one drug pill or something when they were reporting on it, and then forgotten about what they left in their wallet. So they bought like, I needed to buy $100 of Bitcoin, and I spent 50 of it on the Silk Road back in 2010. And now it's like 500K or something. And then they have to find their keys, and some of them did, some of them lost it.
And so the crazy thing about this is, so Ross in the very, very early days in 2011 had a girlfriend. She didn't agree with with what he was doing. And she basically gave him an ultimatum at one point, like me or Silk Road. He chose Silk Road, founder mode, absolute dog. So he goes with that. And then at one point, like later, he tells her they get together again at some point in San Francisco, and he tells her that I gave the site away, all this stuff. Her roommate also during this time found out about it. Because like they got in an argument, and she posted on his Facebook wall, like, I hope the authorities don't find out about Ross Ulbricht's drug website, and then like deleted it. He got her to delete it. And so he had a couple loose ends here. The other thing that's crazy about his experience doing this is so anybody who's built a company before, that it's the kind of thing that you're thinking about around the clock, right? You'll wake up at 3 a.m., you're thinking about it. Right as you're going to bed, you're telling your significant other about it, whatever. It's not something you can get off your mind, and it's a very uncomfortable thing to not be able to talk about it, because you have all these ideas, like like we're in the gym, I'm like, I need to talk to you about this challenge, whatever. So Ross doesn't have any of that. He has his girlfriend at first, and then she's like, oh, wow, like my boyfriend is like a narco trafficker, like digital pirate, like this is crazy. So that ends. And then he starts to develop these friendships online, people that he's talking to, people that are users of the platform, people that are sellers. And so he starts developing these friendships. He's got a buddy that's in Vietnam. I forget.
He's really developing like two worlds, almost like a split personality thing. Like he
doesn't have that much of a IRL life.
Doesn't have much of an IRL life, and then he actually splits his computer hard drive in two and kind of has two wings of the computer, one for his personal life, one for the Dread Pirate Roberts, and it's almost like there's like he can switch to just being a completely different person, completely different moral framework, because even during the trial, a lot of the witness testimony, character witnesses were like, even during this period, like he was just totally normal guy. And it's like he was able to put on one face and then go online and then be chatting with people about like, oh yeah, let's kill this person and let's bring in 1 million pounds of meth.
Send me the photo when you finish the job, So and this whole time, so law enforcement already by this point has started to develop, like use anonymous accounts to develop relationships with him. He already has law enforcement that are buying drugs on the platform to like build cases, and they're trying to, he has this guy, Duyegi, what's his name? Do you remember?
I don't remember.
His name?
No.
So this is a random guy in Chicago who's with Homeland Security who's painstakingly collecting thousands of Silk Road orders, which he had figured out. Historically, apparently people would send drugs in the mail and they'd have like these handwritten letters. So that was like one way you could potentially identify.
Sure.
But then people on Silk Road wanted to look like they were more professional. So they would print out these sort of like
mailing
address,
labels,
mailing, return labels. And so there was this guy, Duyegi, I forget his name. And what's crazy is many of these law enforcement people themselves end up committing crimes as part of the process. And
it's
then
so
they get
chaotic.
taken. It's like the most chaotic story.
And I mean, there's just so many different organizations involved in this. The DEA, the FBI, the IRS, Homeland Security, the Secret Service, and then they all have varying levels of jurisdiction and abilities.
And they all want to win.
They all want to win.
And they all want credit for it.
They all want credit for it. And so it's just chaotic. Let's go through some of the posts just to kind of break it up. I have this one from Rune here who says, okay, but where are the crypto conferences for people building illegal stuff? I'm talking next generation impenetrable Silk Road, evading Chinese capital controls, war bonds. Hit me up. And this was back in 2022 when crypto was obsessed with like NFTs and just kind of like
pre-FTX crash.
Yeah. I think this is pre-FTX, and so I mean, I think that we can obviously intellectually understand that like everything that happened here was terrible. It's a tragedy. It's like bad in so many ways. But it's deep down, I think if you don't recognize that, like, you know, crime stories are a little bit cool and like edgy, like that's just a very natural impulse. And I think that's what drew a lot of people to this story. And then, the whole reason that we're talking about this is this clip from Autism Capital that says, breaking, Trump confirms that if he becomes president, he will commute the sentence of Silk Road founder Ross Ulbricht. So this was in May of last year before. So the whole reason that we wound up in this situation is because there was this massive campaign that we'll get into, Free Ross, that was driven by his mother, and she'd been campaigning for him a long time.
And there were a lot of married.
Yeah.
At one point,
and she was working on the project, and then there were a lot of libertarians and a lot of Bitcoin people that were like, get him out. And so it became this like bargaining chip with Trump as like, oh, we will back you super hard if you give us our boy back. And so this is when on January 21st, Ross Ulbricht has been fully pardoned. And Donald Trump says, I just called the mother of Ross William Ulbricht, he misspells his name, to let her know that in honor of her and the libertarian movement.
He's signing the papers. He's like, what did this guy do again? Murder for hire?
Yeah. Which supported me. And they will tell you he didn't get convicted of that.
Yeah.
He didn't get convicted of that.
To be
allegedly.
Yeah.
It was my pleasure to have signed a full and unconditional pardon of her son Ross. The scum that worked to convict him were some of the same lunatics that were involved in the modern day weaponization of government against me. He was given 2 life sentences plus 40 years. Ridiculous. And Sagar says, I'm no fan of the Silk Road, but the way the FBI set up Ross Ulbricht for life is still one of the most insane cases I've ever read about. And so Sagar is like hugely anti-drug, even anti-weed, marijuana.
Yep.
Cannabis, but still, this is a nuanced topic. And it is possible that someone could be doing something really bad, and then the government can come in and throw the book at them even harder than they should.
Yeah, and so getting kind of into that, you had one of the I forget if they were I don't think they were FBI, but maybe Homeland Security. At one point, one of the guys had was selling secrets to Ross about all the investigations and had made somewhere over $500,000 selling information to Ross about the case, even though he kind of still wanted to get him. But it became this whole game that you could tell that
double agent.
All the agents involved with it were so consumed in the cat and mouse game of chasing this guy. Really, he at one point got citizenship in the Dominican Republic, but it wasn't really a big factor in the story. And so the other thing is, like, you would imagine that this guy would take off and be in Eastern Europe or Asia somewhere. He went to Australia at one point, but he was just really visiting his sister.
I think he did go to the Dominican Republic briefly.
But it was
maybe
just
to set up some accounts.
I think
but
he
that was
needed
it.
to invest like $100K or under 6 figures to actually get that.
And so let's do a little bit of a tour of the agencies involved in this. The DEA would send agents to infiltrate the marketplace by posing as large-scale narcotics traffickers. The FBI was focused on tracing the Silk Road server, which they eventually got. I think there was one in Iceland or something that they were able to get and decrypt. The IRS wanted to follow the money trail. Homeland Security specialized in customs and import control that recognized that packages from overseas were flooding the U.S. postal system. One key figure was Gary Alford, an IRS investigator who approached the Silk Road puzzle by following internet breadcrumbs. He started analyzing older forum posts discussing Silk Road's launch, focusing on handles like Altoid that might have inadvertently revealed a personal connection.
And so this guy, this IRS agent, ended up getting taken down because he was he was profiting in different ways from the investigation and very, very corrupt.
Yeah.
But he was one of the guys that traced those old forum posts.
Yeah.
Found posts that an account that was called Altoid created by Ross Ulbricht at Gmail.
Yeah.
That then he changed to a fake email called Frosty@Frosty.
Yep.
But then he had used
Frosty.
He called the Iceland server Frosty.
Yeah.
So they tied that together.
Not enough imagination on the username generation, bro.
Yeah.
You got to get a password generator.
Yeah.
Just go full random. It's the Gary Alford guy. I read a thread about him as well, about how what was interesting was that he didn't have access to like really crazy proprietary databases and the fingerprint database and the DNA database. It was really just like Google. He was just really good at just like Googling around, finding usernames here, piecing things together. And so all of these investigations were hampered by a lack of interagency coordination. Rather than pooling intelligence, each unit often withheld leads, hoping they could be the ones to crack the case. This fragmented approach would simultaneously prolong the manhunt and create openings for suspicious behavior. Indeed, 2 law enforcement agents, Carl Force, DEA, what a great name, and Sean Bridges, Secret Service, would later be indicted for misusing the case to enrich themselves.
Wait,
However,
it wasn't the IRS guy then?
I don't think so. I'm not sure, but
I thought he got taken down as well.
No, I think Gary Alford was fine.
Okay.
I mean, it was like the whole thing was just
so
massive chaotic because it's
And
all
the
just happening on the
government-
dark
and
web and there's
the
money
government-
flowing around Bitcoin and everyone thinks it's anonymous. It's not,
Yeah.
but everyone thinks
And
it is.
they would have these meetings called deconfliction meetings.
Yep.
Where they'd bring everybody together and like some people would share information and other people would be like, I'm not going to share that. Like this is my edge in the case. And so it's a very toxic dynamic where within those types of organizations, you rank up and get more titles and comp and paid leave and vacation by cracking cases. And so everybody was self-interested in wanting to crack the case themselves and get credit for it.
Yeah. It's always crazy looking at the
dynamic.
numbers. It's like he stole like $50,000 and then like you look at the price of Bitcoin now and it's like, oh, that would have been like, hundreds of millions if they had like been able to hold on to it. But
yeah, the other thing about so law enforcement is like starting to have this like very like multi-pronged chaotic.
Yeah.
And it didn't take them that long to really start to get some real leads into him and start to put the pressure on, right? So at this time they're creating fake identities, they're taking over, they're finding sellers. They're going to sellers and they're saying, we are going to put you in prison for life for selling drugs.
Yep.
Or we'll give you a better sentence if you give us your seller account.
Yeah.
Flip. So then they would flip sellers.
Yep.
And then they would just be in there, and they also started flipping like different moderators.
Yep.
And they also just started creating entirely new accounts where they would come in and be like, yeah, I'm a narco trafficker. And then they would slowly develop a friendship. And there was this weird situation where to develop trust, they would have to give him advice.
Like real advice.
Yeah. Like you should get 3 passports.
Yeah.
You should get fake passports. You should be able to get to Asia. You should have a contingency plan to get here. You should split up your Bitcoin holdings so that, if you get taken down here, like, you'll still, and then on the platform level, they had created this sort of PayPal style system, right?
Yep.
It was very effective. Every now and then a seller would build up so much selling history that it's very easy for them to be like, anybody that sends Bitcoin to this address and sends me their address. So people would circumnavigate the platform, right? This happens with all marketplaces, right? Even on Airbnb, somebody will book an Airbnb for like 2 weeks and then they'll talk to the owner and they'll be like, hey, like, can I just book it through you and like save on the Airbnb fees?
Yep.
And so every now and then these sellers would there was one that happened on 420 where this certain seller was like, hey, like, if you just pay me directly, like, and they had a big selling history, so everybody trusted them, and they did like 250K in sales in a day, and then just like gone, right?
Yeah.
So that would happen, and then Ross would be in this position where he would have all these people that were mad at him. His users are pissed at him, but he would be like, well, you circumnavigated the platform to try to save what are not crazy. The other crazy thing, so Silk Road's take rate for selling drugs, doing the most illegal activity, is 40% lower than Substack, which sells information.
Is that true? Substack's not 50%.
No, 40% lower. Substack's 10%.
Oh, okay, 6%.
So Silk Road was 6.25%.
And I think it's way lower than OnlyFans too. I think
OnlyFans
is like 20%.
Yeah,
right?
it's like way. So Ross was so mission oriented that he really believed. The part of the crypto ideals is there's these financial institutions. They have these crazy take rates. And so he's only getting double the take rate basically of Stripe. And Stripe is like the most regulated, just like vanilla, like we sell SaaS. Right? He's selling drugs at scale online, and
he could be taking like 30%, but he's not.
And he's not. And he still had issues because the kind of people he was dealing with, people that are buying small quantities of drugs online are probably not the most affluent crowd for the most part. So they would have issues with it. And so he keeps dealing with this stuff. And he also has, he has issues where, something would happen to a seller and then the cartels would be coming to him saying like, hey, like you owe us $1 million. And then he'd be like trying to do deals with them. Yeah. And so every marketplace founder understands that at a certain point you have this programmatic system that you're running, right? Where like, let's say you have Airbnb, but early days, I'm sure that the Airbnb founders would have to be talking to like one of their listing people and being like, hey, like we got to work this out. Yeah. But in Ross's situation, he was dealing with cartels, narco traffickers, drug dealers, and people buying drugs. And so it's not like they painted a picture like he's just sitting there and like he created the software and it's just running.
He's just writing code. That's
but
it.
He would be, at one point he was wanting to test into a product. He was encouraged by someone in law enforcement who had built up this fake identity that he was friends with. Hey, you should create the Masters of the Silk Road, which was a version of Silk Road specifically for global drug cartels. and so Ross worked with his team. He's like, hey, we got to move a kilo right now. And so he was just selling drugs.
Just drug dealing fully.
He was just fully drug dealing.
It's wild.
And then I don't think Masters of the Silk Road really took off. He also around this time, I don't know where we get to it. So people would start listing weapons.
Well, yeah. So I have some extra. So he kind of finds like a almost pseudo co-founder, this ally Variety Jones, who offers him marketing tips, security advice, and even recommended that Ross consider violent tactics against potential threats. He starts thinking about all this violence and alleged murder for hire plots, which would become pivotal to the federal charges against him. And there's still some debate over whether these plots were real or entrapment. But it's really insane how fast the site grows. We said it started in 2011. By late 2012 and into 2013, Silk Road was grossing hundreds of millions of dollars in transactions. Its user base extended across continents, and shipments were moving through postal systems at astonishing rates. Within this environment, Ross grappled with immense stress, anxious that each day could be his last as a free man. Still, he persisted, motivated by profits, ideology, and perhaps the thrill of running a digital empire unrestrained by traditional laws.
And so at this point, he's in San Francisco.
Yep.
He's living in random like he's not living the lifestyle of Pablo Escobar and nice houses and cars. He's living in San Francisco paying cash under a fake identity, something Terry Jones or something like that. He orders fake IDs off of the dark web, off of his own website. So he gets a handful of fake IDs. They get caught in the mail by Homeland Security. And at one point, Homeland Security comes and knocks on his door. And he's like, oh, it's over. Like he thought he was getting taken down. And they were just like, hey, like we got these fake IDs addressed to you. Yeah.
It's too small of an issue to be big for us. We just want to know more about the dark web.
Yeah. So he's like, no. They were like, can you tell us, like, we're not going to like do anything right. We're not going to arrest you right now. but where did you get these? And he goes on record and says, there's a site called Silk Road. He can't help himself.
He goes in pitching mode.
He goes into pitching mode, founder mode.
Yeah.
He's like, well, actually, there's this site you can go on called the Silk Road.
It's amazing. Only 6% take rate.
6% take
and
rate.
use this coupon code to sign
and
up.
you can add some other stuff to your cart.
Yeah,
you know?
guns, drugs, do whatever. Yeah. So he's like pitching.
And so he gets on the record at that moment. That was the first time he was in the system for committing a crime, and they added I don't know how it works, but they added notes to like his profile that he had talked about the Silk Road, which ended up coming back to bite him later.
Yeah. And so the DEA at this point is posing as major buyers. The FBI is focusing on these high-tech methods. They find a server in Iceland, and there's a bunch of friction between the different agencies because no one really knows who's dealing with cybercrime. So Jared Duryegian.
That's Duryegian.
Duryegian, who was
This is a guy who's
Security.
just obsessed. Duryegian had collected thousands of orders that he had personally caught.
Yeah.
And he had just been categorizing them and tracing them to different seller profiles.
And he's flipping the dealers to become important, become informants. He gleaned details about Silk Road's internal workings, including how vendors ship products. Other groups try to trace the site's IP addresses using advanced hacking techniques. At one point, the FBI exploited what might have been a misconfiguration in a Silk Road CAPTCHA or login screen, gleaning a real IP address that led them to a data center in Iceland. So the whole goal of Tor is to mask the IP address and route through a bunch of different anyone who's running a Tor server all over. So you could if you just have Spectrum or AT&T internet, you can spin up a Tor server and then you're routing random traffic constantly. And so that anonymizes things because the traffic's just going all over the place. You can't trace it all. And so anytime it goes through some random server, it comes out the other side randomized or disguised, and it's very, very hard to track down. But they found the actual IP address because it seems like the CAPTCHA that was being rendered wasn't going through Tor. It was going through it wasn't being anonymized properly. Yeah. So they figure it out. They issue the warrant.
This is something that happens throughout the whole Silk Road journey is because he's a first-time developer, first-time founder,
rookie.
He's just making all these mistakes and oftentimes suffering financial losses, but the site's doing so well and growing so quickly, the losses are offset. But the one thing that's kind of hard to make up for is getting caught.
Getting caught. And so they grab the server from Iceland, decrypt it, and it's like the database. It has all the information, and then they're combing through it for clues that could lead them to who this guy is, or how the
and it wasn't hard
works.
To flip the whatever company in Iceland had the server.
Oh, no.
You get approached by U.S. law enforcement. They're like, we believe people are committing crimes on your server.
And they're just like, you just want us to copy it? Sure, no problem. Yeah. Whatever.
And that goes in, and to be clear, as they uncovered, they got data on all the buyers and sellers and presumably all the transactions that had happened in Silk Road history, right?
Oh, yeah.
It was encrypted, but they were able to basically crack it.
Yeah, and every escrow transaction is logged in a database because it has to, even though the blockchain might be somewhat anonymized, it's not anonymized when it sits on the database record of the Silk Road, which they got access to.
And so it's not like every person who had ever bought drugs or sold drugs on the Silk Road suffered from that.
Yeah.
But if the government had wanted to, they could have gone and knocked on all the addresses.
Exactly.
Obviously, people would use fake addresses and fake names and things like that. But
and so by 2013, enough agencies had processed enough scraps of evidence that Ross Ulbricht's identity was starting to come into focus, though they had yet to conclusively tie him to Dread Pirate Roberts. Ross, for his part, was often oblivious to the scale of the manhunt, trusting in Tor and Bitcoin's layers of security while continuing to manage Silk Road from cafes and libraries around San Francisco. And so the corruption scandal continues. Karl Mark Force IV and Sean Bridges of the Secret Service. What a great name.
Mark Force.
The DEA and the Secret Service is one of the most dramatic subplots here. Both men were tasked with bringing down the Silk Road, yet they exploited their positions for personal gain. Force, who operated undercover personas like Knob on Silk Road, directly interacted with DPR.
And so Knob was basically boys with.
Oh yeah,
he
they
was
were like chatting
absolute
constantly,
boys, talking all day long.
Yeah.
Knob would give him Knob is the guy who'd give him advice. You should get more passports.
Yeah.
Things like that, and people were like, "Dude, stop giving him such good advice."
And he messed up because at one point he had a fake account and was chatting with Dread Pirate Roberts and was like it's Carl or something like that. And he was like, wait, what? And he was like, oh, Carl, Carla. Like I go by a bunch of different names.
But that was all on record.
Logged, yeah.
And then was it Sean Bridges at one point that later, once Sean knew he was getting caught, Sean was like, I will get you killed in prison. Yeah. Like he was like threatening, like you're going to get caught. Delete all these records. And so, yeah, it was basically slop on both sides.
Yeah, very sloppy. And so from Ross's perspective, these agents' manipulative activities made the Silk Road environment feel ever more treacherous. Logs released in court showed Ross confiding to trusted confidants that he suspected infiltration at every turn. He also struggled with evaluating demands for hush money or hits on suspected blackmailers. Whether Ross seriously believed in orchestrating murder for hire or if he was cornered into entertaining the idea is still debated. Nevertheless, chat logs indicate that Ross agreed to pay for violent solutions if it meant protecting Silk Road's anonymity and his own.
Yeah, so this is when I posted this, and a lot of people are like, "Oh, you left out murder for hire."
Yeah.
Obviously, on this post, I was purely talking about the business, not endorsing his actions in any way. But yeah, he over the course of this 2013 era got very comfortable with the idea of paying to get people killed. So these were people that he thought were informants, people that he thought were just generally bad actors.
Yep.
There's records of him ordering hits and actually negotiating the price of hits, saying, being kind of frustrated with how expensive something would be, and the person would be like, well, it's like last minute, and it's kind of a complicated situation, and he'd be like, okay. He would be provided photo evidence of success, what he thought were successful hits. At one point, law enforcement faked one of the hits using like Campbell's soup. And they were taking and using like crappy phone images to like take a picture of somebody's face, like with like Campbell's soup, like as if their face had been like
blown off
or whatever.
Yeah.
So very, very dark. Like he clearly at this point was like living this dual life of like he's Ross and then he's Dread Pirate Roberts.
Yeah.
And he's willing to do anything to protect the pirate ship.
Yeah, exactly.
Silk Road.
Yeah. And I think we have a post here. It's probably a few deep, Ben, but this is a screenshot from Reddit. It says, are there any merits to the claims that he hired a hitman to kill Friendly Chemist, someone on Silk Road who said they would leak personal info on thousands of Silk Road users unless paid $500K? I've never seen this discussed in our weekly Ross posts.
Yeah, so this was, there was a user who hacked the server in some way. They were able to uncover quite a lot of data on like the sellers.
Yep. And
so Ross was worried that, if people realize that if you bought something on the platform and that your personal information could be exposed, then obviously it was going to really slow down sales.
Yep.
He's also facing competition at this time.
Yep.
Other sites are popping up that are doing the same thing.
Yep.
So he really didn't want this information to get leaked.
Yep.
And he,
someone replies to this and says, Ross ordered hits on 4 to 5 people total. The evidence of this, the evidence that he did this is clear. No one here likes talking about this because it ruins the narrative. Now, the sentence for ordering a hit in California, if I recall correctly, is 10 years per contract. So he definitely got a harsher sentence than this, but there were other crimes he was guilty of. Not that it will save me from downvotes, but El Chapo is significantly worse than Ross, and any system that gives Chapo less time than Ross is busted. But to ignore that Ross didn't try to have people executed is doing no favors to anyone who wants to have an honest discussion about justice. And I think that's just a very interesting thing where there was this like big narrative. And if we go back to this debate between Matt Palmer and Joe Posting, Matt says Ross Ulbricht's work was one of the largest contributions to harm reduction in narcotics distribution ever. The systems he created removed violence from the drug trade by anonymizing and physically dislocating transactions. He almost certainly saved thousands of lives. But Joe says, skeptical of this claim, the vast majority of drug trade violence is caused by production, namely South American cartels and opium warlords in the Golden Triangle. Silk Road made retail purchases safer, but that's small potatoes next to the back end. And it's funny because, it's like, yeah, he might have removed some violence, but then he added it all back by trying to commit hits. It's like, come on. It's just a ridiculous situation. But moving on, we're in mid-2013, and there are enough threads of investigation that had converged that a direct confrontation with Ross Ulbricht was inevitable. Each agency.
So at this time, they had figured out a number of people. So they started with profiles. Like, we think he's a smart guy. We think he's in America. We think he's.
Oh, one of the ways they figured out was hilarious was that he had posted something about how buying drugs on the street is dangerous, and he says something about like those people, and so they use that to justify this idea that he came from like a white middle class upbringing and was not like a street guy, because he would have said like, when we buy stuff on the street we get shot and killed. He was like they get shot and killed, and so that made it clear that he wasn't like from the rough and tumble streets.
And so at one point he was a suspect just based on his profile of being, interested in technology and libertarianism and all this stuff. But they still were like, people didn't believe that he could have done it because he didn't fit the hacker, like internet hacker developer archetype, because they were like, well, he didn't study computer science. And so they had this other suspect who had run like a Bitcoin forum that was like more of the prime suspect at the time. So he had some non-believers in law enforcement that were like, it could be Ross, but like, we don't think he's got that dog in him.
Yeah. And so the main breakthrough came from Gary Alford, the IRS agent, and he was convinced that Ross Ulbricht made a slip up early on. And so he scoured internet forums such as bitcointalk.org and shroomery.org, going back to the earliest,
was where he was
posted, hey, anybody want to get some shrooms? Check out this website.
No, he was like, has anybody bought shrooms from Silk Road?
Yeah.
And it was him selling the shrooms.
And so he reasoned that whoever created the site might have posted about it during its infancy before it was famous enough to attract major scrutiny. And this is very funny. This actually happened in my high school. There was someone who put up a cyberbullying type website, and the easiest way to figure out who was behind it's still like myth in my high school, but I'm convinced I know who it was because I basically traced it back to patient zero, and the first person to say anything about it was likely the person that did it. Yeah. Because like, how else would it go viral? Like, it has to have somebody that introduces it, because if a website's just up there on the internet, like, no one's going to find that. But the first person to say, hey, have you seen this? That person is,
guilty.
And I'm very convinced of this. So Alford, this is Gary Alford. He discovered a user named Altoid posting in January of 2011, right at the start of Silk Road, mentioning Silk Road and suggesting people check it out. Further digging reveals that the same user had made a subsequent post looking to hire a tech specialist, leaving the email address rossulbricht@gmail.com. This was the smoking gun Alford had been searching for, as it linked a real-life individual to Silk Road's initial marketing efforts. While other investigators were pursuing the server's physical location, Alford's simpler forensic analysis of publicly available posts provided a direct link to Ross.
And so Ross had gone back to that forum. He knew he had kind of messed up, and so he changed the email on that account to a fake email.
Yeah, but you can see the change.
But then you can see the change, and then the name he used for the fake email ended up being the same name he used to name the server. Yep. So he liked the name Frosty or something.
Yeah, and so at this point, they were definitely suspicious of Ross, but they needed to catch him red-handed, logged in as the Dread Pirate Roberts on his laptop if they hoped to secure a watertight prosecution. Detective work in the digital age can hinge on human error. The Altoid handle and the Gmail address turned out to be one of Ross's biggest mistakes, an unintentional breadcrumb left behind before the Silk Road success.
One thing I'll note here, this is just speculation, but his girlfriend at one point said that he was a big marijuana fan. I think he admitted to it at different points as Dread Pirate Roberts. And marijuana is a performance decreasing drug. It makes people forgetful. It makes people anxious and all these things. And so imagining him as a first-time developer, high all the time, trying to, committing crimes at scale. And again, I respect the libertarian view that says, well, nothing he's doing was wrong, but he was committing crimes by way of our legal system.
Yeah.
And so imagining him just like hanging around San Francisco smoking pot, like being a narco trafficker, it's like not it's inevitable. There's other people that would have made it like 7 years, 8 years, 9 years, 10 years. There's narco, like real narcos that make it 30 years.
Yeah,
right?
They buy soccer teams. Mansions.
They get presidents elected.
Yeah, it's crazy.
So it's actually wild to think about if he had maybe not as intense of a marijuana habit or gone and went to Russia or something like that.
Totally.
There's a world where he would have become like a Bitcoin, 100 billionaire, like one of the wealthiest, most influential people in the world, and could have been out of reach in many ways.
Totally. Yeah. It is so funny that he, his whole philosophy was based on this idea of like drugs aren't this gateway, nothing bad can happen if you start doing a lot of drugs, and then he is the best case study for drugs ruining your life. Like, drugs completely ruined his life. Started doing drugs, then started selling drugs, then started trying to get people killed, then got massively arrested and thrown in jail for a decade. It's like, drugs were not good for you, bro. Like, calm down.
Yep.
And so as the law enforcement officials homed in on Ross Ulbricht, they began careful physical surveillance. His whole laptop was heavily encrypted, and he had a single button that if he pushed it, it would lock and encrypt the hard drive. So even if you got access to it, you couldn't access it without a password. They had no way to guess the password. It would take a computer millions of years to, decrypt that, or hundreds of years to force the decryption. Although maybe it's faster now, who knows? But at the time they were very worried, and they were like, we have to get him while his hands are on the keyboard or hands off the keyboard, but he's still logged in. And so they were excited about the idea that he kept working in public spaces because they could stage an unexpected confrontation.
And it's just the irony here of him in another reality. He would have been in Y Combinator just absolutely crushing it on some like normal business. Yeah. And so he would have been in these coffee shops in San Francisco at the explosion of the sharing economy and mobile.
Oh, yeah.
And he would be sitting next to people that, it's not unlikely that some like very well-known founders today, like we're in the same coffee shop, right?
Totally.
Just the craziness of doing this all like from the epicenter of tech.
I lived in San Francisco when this happened. and I would go to this library. I would go to the San Francisco Public Library. I actually worked out of there a few times.
Crazy.
And so on October 1st, 2013, Ross Ulbricht walked into the Glen Park branch of the San Francisco Public Library, sat down and opened his laptop. Unbeknownst to him, undercover agents sat nearby. Agents orchestrated a ruse where one undercover officer posed as a feuding couple, creating a minor commotion to divert Ross's attention. As Ross turned his head, other agents sprang from behind, grabbing his laptop before he could even move to close the lid. The narrative of the takedown is cinematic. Ross is stunned, half standing, and as FBI pushes him back into his seat and secures arms.
To visualize this, a male and a female agent start yelling and like pushing each other.
Yeah.
He looks over.
And then the person just reaches. Yeah. It's literally a woman who's an agent just sits right across the table and just is like, pull this away. Don't touch it.
And so has it open. And so they immediately, what they do is they take it, and they rush it to a van outside. Yeah. Like imagine like you're like trying to keep your computer from going to sleep.
Oh yeah, that's what they're doing.
And so they're making sure they're moving the mouse.
Move the mouse.
And so for the next like 10 hours, they just sit there like moving the mouse and like downloading all of the data off the computer and like backing it. I think they backed it up like 9 times in 9 different ways. Yeah. And you could imagine because when after we'll talk about this in a bit, as they go to prosecute him, the defense's main defense is that it wasn't Ross.
Yeah.
That's their main thing. They were like the
somebody
real
else.
Dread Pirate Roberts framed him. They put all this evidence on his laptop, but like, they obviously caught him.
Yeah, literally red-handed. Yeah,
and
it's like if there was like some sort of like screen sharing software where maybe he was just using his computer, and then the real Dread Pirate Roberts was like, putting evidence on there. There would be evidence of that software.
But they tracked him so many times where they would be physically viewing him. He's typing.
And it would be like, he logs on.
Because they had moles on the Silk Road team. So they had like law enforcement was being paid to work for the Silk Road. And so they would see when he logged on and he'd be typing, and they would be recording all of this where they'd be watching him typing and Dread Pirate Roberts is typing, And so it was kind of a tough argument to make, even though various members of law enforcement were committing their own heinous crimes. It's sort of difficult to defend.
And related to that, we have a post from Sam Parr. He did a podcast on Ross Ulbricht, the founder of Silk Road. And he says, he admitted to creating the Silk Road, but said he sold it to a new owner, and they're the ones who did the murder for hire. What do you think? Was Ross the owner the entire time, or ordered to murder for hire, or no? Why? And Anthony J. Descenzo says, of course he owned and operated it the entire time. He admitted to creating the Silk Road at the beginning and was caught red-handed working on the administration page at the ending. And he follow his Bitcoins from start to finish.
And I completely agree with that. He had tried to... He told his girlfriend once that he was no longer running it. Then she walked in on him after like they were hanging out.
There's just so much evidence. It's so clear.
And then later he even had this crisis on the platform where he made a post where he's like, I'm going to change the way I talk so that it's less obvious who I am. And then everybody was like, got really mad at him because they were like, wait, like, is this safe to use now? Did they flip him or something like that?
Yeah. So in the days following his arrest, the global community of Silk Road users found themselves in disarray. Vendors, buyers, and administrators scrambled to figure out whether their personal identities had been compromised, because as part of the onboarding process to work for the Silk Road, you would have to send him a photo of your real driver's license. Yeah. And it was kind of this like getting sworn in into the secret society. There was panic over Bitcoin funds held in escrow, which now seemed out of reach. People posted frantic messages on the dark web, some lamenting the loss of their livelihood. Oh, it's terrible. You know, you build a drug business and it just goes up in smoke one day. Others questioning whether the Dread Pirate Roberts persona might somehow live on. Law enforcement officials. Also, it's like if there was a real Dread Pirate Roberts who his fall guy gets busted, why wouldn't he just keep operating the site?
Make a new fall
or like
guy.
make a new thing. Just.
You can think about it. So at this point,
or even just move the Bitcoins to something else.
They're doing hundreds of millions of volume a year.
Yeah.
And you could imagine at any one point there's, I don't know, very rough estimate would be $100 million of like drugs, like changing hands. And so that was quite a lot of money that was just locked up in escrow at this time. That was clearly the Silk Road team had to be the team that would approve when, the recipient would say, yes, got it.
Yep.
Then they would approve, the payout.
Yeah. And so afterwards, after the arrest, law enforcement officials lauded the arrest as a significant victory in the war on cybercrime. Politicians who had long criticized Silk Road took credit for pushing agencies to shut it down. Mainstream media coverage exploded with headlines labeling Ross as everything from a brilliant hacker to a modern-day outlaw. The sensationalism surrounding the Kingpin moniker overshadowed the complexities of Ross's motivation. He was painted as a cold-blooded trafficker who profited off of addiction and despair. I think that's probably correct. His friends and family were stunned.
He definitely was cold-blooded.
Totally.
He was able to separate the nice guy, Ross, who had a loving family, from... He fully embodied the Dread Pirate Roberts.
I wonder if there's anyone that gets to this level that isn't cold-blooded, though. It's like, it's kind of a prerequisite.
Every billion dollar, every unicorn CEO that I know,
cold-blooded,
even the ones that are nice, you can tell.
Ice in their veins.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, the government's forensic teams sifted through the trove of data from Ross's computer. They discovered personal diaries, chat logs between Dread Pirate Roberts and administrators, and spreadsheets detailing profits. The data portrayed a person intimately involved in day-to-day operations, from vendor disputes to strategies and strategies for evading law enforcement.
You could just call that drug argument.
It's just like how to evade the government, federal, the IRS.txt. How to beat the
that was a big
service.
part of this. He was not living this high life because he had all this Bitcoin, but he couldn't really figure out a way to get it off chain.
Yeah. It was clear that Ross faced a battery of charges: money laundering, computer hacking, drug trafficking, and conspiracy to commit murder. The last charge stemmed from his suspected willingness to eliminate threats to Silk Road's anonymity. Whether or not actual violence occurred, federal prosecutors used the chat transcripts to argue that Ross was willing to orchestrate killings. As the immediate chaos settled, the case moved toward a long legal process that would captivate the public and set legal precedents about dark web marketplaces. And so the defense strategy, the legal defense strategy for Ross, focused in on a few key ideas. Wrongful identification. They argued that Ross wasn't the true Dread Pirate Roberts and that the real DPR had set him up. reliability of evidence. They questioned whether the laptop data could have been tampered with, especially considering the corruption charges.
Because of how corrupt many members, or not many, but
well,
at least two.
Carl Force and Sean Bridges.
Carl Force.
It's like, maybe there was something weird going on.
Yeah, and they were encouraging him to do things that were, like that was a whole, like I think it was Knob who would be like, yeah, you should take this guy out, you know? And it's...
Oh, yeah, they definitely
and
pushed
law
him
enforcement
on that.
helped
That's the entrapment thing.
They helped him.
Yeah.
They were involved with helping fake these sort of murders as well.
Yeah. And so they wound up not convicting him of that, but it definitely like set the tone of the trial and kind of get people out of this mindset of like,
clear,
he just built a website. It's like, he built a website and maybe he did this other stuff. We're not even going to push him on that, but it like threw
maybe he did a few
else.
things that didn't scale. But it also is interesting. It would have been sort of, I imagine, untenable if he was convicted on the murder for hire stuff to actually get pardoned. So that small detail, I think it doesn't seem like Trump knows his actual name.
Yeah,
but I imagine there would have been much more pushback if he had been actually convicted of.
So look at this digital diary. There's an excerpt in here that says, "I'm doing about $2 million a week in sales now." They also had logs with references to specific violent acts that Ross had allegedly considered, or at least verbally agreed to pay for.
And so he had
a plea deal.
Sent
he says now
$750,000 of money to fund hits.
Yeah.
So he was paying for the hits.
Yeah,
they weren't happening.
So he pleads not guilty, and there's a public trial. His mother becomes a tireless advocate for his cause. They argued that the government was making an example out of him, which I think is probably true, since this was like the first major cybercrime deep web case.
Yeah.
And if they didn't throw the book at him, there would just be a million more.
And there was there was Gawker articles.
Like
that
exactly.
was what catalyzed
it became
all.
Mainstream for sure.
And so it's very embarrassing to law enforcement to have a website that anybody can go to buy.
Yep.
That's, if law enforcement can log in and view it, and regular, like a high school kid can do it, and some, grandma can do it.
Yeah, it's just such a violation of like the social contract there.
Yeah.
In the end, the case would be resolved in the public eye, with Ross heading to trial January of 2015, a date that would not only decide his fate, but set a precedent for the future of dark web marketplaces. The trial took place in New York, in Manhattan Federal Court, presided over by Judge Catherine Forrest. It was a high-profile case, and the courtroom was often packed with journalists, curious onlookers, and Ross supporters. The atmosphere was tense. The prosecution maintained a mountain of files, presented a mountain of files taken from Ross's laptops.
So this was part of the challenge for the defense, is there was like 6 terabytes of data that they were like using against him, and so they're like, we're gonna use all of this against you. Like, good luck. One other thing he benefited from is he had tried to set up a Silk Road armory.
Oh yeah,
but it totally flopped.
Yeah.
Sometimes you hit PMF with one thing.
Side project.
He realized that it was like much harder to like send guns in the mail.
Oh yeah,
and
totally.
But he was trying to sell. I think you could buy explosives on the Silk Road.
Grenades, and you can buy fully automatic weapons.
Which is just like even I think that gave Ross some pause around
This was the libertarian thing that always got to me. It's like he would argue that I am willing to consent to sell drugs. You're willing to buy drugs. Therefore, the government has no say in that. But there's always this question of like negative externalities. And what got to me was like, well, at a certain point you were selling like cyanide, and also it's like, okay, even if that's not bad between the two parties, what about the UPS guy that has to carry that? Like, did they opt into that?
So if explosives are going into the mail,
it's like, oh, I'm just a FedEx driver, and now I have to carry grenades. Like, I didn't opt into that. Like, in your libertarian philosophy, I don't consent to that.
Libertarianism seems to work if you had a private island.
Yes,
and everybody there is there by their
Epstein
own.
Joke.
Yeah, I mean, like,
it sounds like it.
I mean, it's basically going there. But when your actions are affecting other people that are participating in a society that has agreed to have certain laws.
Yeah, you never think about the next negative externality of, okay, you brought these drugs in, and then the drug dealer's on the street and commits violence because of this, or you're funding it's always just, let's look at just the one micro interaction and not consider the knock-on effects. And that's why we have like an actual society and societal contract. And so The government witnesses included law enforcement agents who had participated in Silk Road investigations. Ross's defense contended that he was set up. Friends testified to his peaceful nature, pointing out how out of character it was for him to order violence or run a massive drug site. Over the course of 3 weeks, jurors were presented with a dizzying array of digital exhibits, as you mentioned, 6 terabytes or something like that, IP addresses, chat logs, and email addresses. And on February 4th, 2015, after only a few hours of deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict on all 7 counts, including narcotics trafficking, computer hacking, money laundering, and maintaining an ongoing criminal enterprise.
Yeah, and so to be clear here, this was like 3 weeks. It was not the kind of trial that stretches on for months and months or years. It was like very quick, and the deck was certainly stacked against him, right? He had all these different agencies that were, and there was so much evidence.
Yeah. And when you think about other trials, it's like, well, yeah, like maybe they got some photos or something, or maybe they kicked down a door and they found someone with something. But it's all there's always this question of like, oh, was it planted? But when you show someone 6 terabytes of like, okay, we got his computer, his hands are on the keyboard, he was logged in. It's a lot harder to paint the
and even
case.
This is why it ends up being really hard for law enforcement to pin down traditional narcos because they get them on money laundering and things like that. Or wire fraud, this stuff that's like unrelated.
Was it Al Capone went down for tax evasion, not drug trafficking?
And it's because it's really hard, especially the Ross was able to build a massive enterprise quickly because of the internet. But he also generated a massive amount of data related to that activity. And a narco, you have like, them on like a radio, talking or whatever. There's less of. A lot of narcos, at least in Mexico, have like regular businesges too that they're talking about. Right? And so not the same mountain of evidence.
Sentencing happens a couple months later, May 29th, 2015. Judge Catherine Forrest sentences him to 2 life sentences plus 40 years. And because it's a federal case, there's no possibility of parole. So he is truly screwed. And this was it was significantly harsher than typical sentences for nonviolent drug offenses, especially given his age, 31 at the time.
Which is like,
it's not that young, but
the whole 30,
He was young. He did this in his 20s, but he wasn't a teenager who was like.
His prefrontal cortex was
fully
developed. And he had a good 5-year run with a full cortex. Full cortex mode.
Yeah. And so
but he was smoking pot. They should have included that.
Yeah. Ross appealed the decision, and this outcome underscored the U.S. justice system's stance on dark web marketplaces, an uncompromising approach that signaled to future clandestine operators that they too could face the rest of their lives in prison. And we didn't really see a replacement pop up very quickly. It was pretty.
I don't know.
I think it was effective.
Many of these transactions like still occur on the dark. Like I think,
but I can't tell you.
But there's
like
not a
Silk
brand
Web
name.
2.0.
Here's the thing. I think historically, anytime a drug has become a brand name, they get taken down, right?
Sure.
And so like that's why when you think about billions of dollars a year of cocaine gets consumed in the U.S. There's no brand that you can think of, right? Sure. And as soon as you tie a brand to it, then there's like, well, now we can start tracing this, so it's just
like
Colombian
cocaine.
That's sort of it's sort of that one's more obvious.
Yeah,
but I imagine that this way more volume happens now. It's just not these sort of brand name marketplaces, right?
Yeah.
Silk Road was the DoorDash,
it really was,
or the Uber of
it was
hits.
Crazy.
Whatever you wanted.
And so Carl Force and Sean Bridges, after the Ross conviction, the scandal emerges and they get sentenced to 6.5 and 6 years. And then more when further misconduct was discovered. And so they go to jail for stealing a bunch of money and basically not doing their job at all. Meanwhile,
it's a weird thing. They were trying to catch him, but they were also trying to make a buck in the process.
Yeah.
Weird thing.
And so it goes on, but let's move. So that was, 2015. In 2016 to 2017, Ross Ulbricht appeals his conviction to the U.S. Court of Appeals, asserting evidence was tainted by law enforcement corruption, but the court upheld the guilty verdict. In May of 2017, the Second Circuit of New York reaffirms Ross's life sentence, reasoning that the massive scope of Silk Road justifies an exceptionally harsh penalty. In 2018, June 28th, the U.S. Supreme Court declines to hear Ross's final appeal, effectively exhausting his direct legal avenues for overturning the conviction. Lynn Ulbricht, during this time, 2015 onward, spearheads the Free Ross movement nationwide, championing her son's cause.
And Lynn is a cracked marketer.
Cracked. Absolutely.
Like, she went to town for her son.
And so in December of 2021, the Ulbricht family auctions Ross's writings and artwork as NFTs online, raising millions through the decentralized organization Free Ross DAO to support continued legal efforts. In 2021 to 2022, a stash of over 50,000 stolen Bitcoin from the Silk Road is seized by the U.S. government, and Ross relinquishes any claim to help satisfy his $183 million restitution order. And in 2024, Pirate Wires reported on April 2nd that the U.S. government has moved roughly $2 billion in Bitcoin confiscated from Silk Road to what's reported to be a Coinbase wallet per CoinDesk.
Yeah, and everybody's like, are they going to market sell this?
Are they going to sell this? Is getting bad. Everyone's worried. And so in May of 2022, Congressman Thomas Massey calls publicly in the House of Representatives for Ross's commutation, viewing the life sentence as a grave injustice beyond appropriate punishment. And in 2024,
to be clear, it is a bad precedent that law enforcement agencies can commit a bunch of their own crimes in the effort to take somebody down, and then still, if they get like it is a terrible precedent, right? We want to live in a society ideally where nobody, a vibey libertarian utopia where nobody's nobody's like hurting each other, but then if one person commits a crime, it doesn't justify another person to commit crimes in order to take that person down. And so while we both believe that many of the things that he did were net negative and bad, it is, the people on the other side of that don't believe he did anything wrong. They also have I don't necessarily think they have a good point there. They do have a point that it's a bad precedent that, law enforcement should be able to commit crimes and then still, deliver this very intense sentencing.
Yeah. And so let's go through some of the more recent facts about how we got to the pardon. In May of 2024, Donald Trump promises that he will pardon Ross on day one, swaying libertarian-minded voters and crypto enthusiasts. In June of 2024, RFK Jr., running for president, similarly vows in a public statement to grant Ross a pardon. In November, Chase Oliver, the Libertarian Party's presidential
wanted to spotlight Silk Road's role in pioneering cryptocurrency, which is kind of like everybody's like really just trying to
get the crypto bros out for sure. The Libertarian Party's presidential nominee reaffirms in Reason magazine that a full pardon aligns with fundamental libertarian principles. Kind of debate that. And then on January 21st, 2025, President Donald Trump signs a full and unconditional pardon from the Oval Office, fulfilling his campaign pledge.
And so the crazy thing about this is, like, imagine you're Ross, you're in jail for a decade.
Yeah.
Trump gets elected, signs a doc. 48 hours later, you just walk out of prison.
Yeah. You're free.
And that's why I felt like this was I wouldn't have wanted to cover this story at all a month ago.
Yeah.
Because it was just purely dark. It's like, okay, he committed a bunch of crimes. Now he's life in jail. Yes, he was.
Now he's off to
the execution
Sand Hill Road.
From a business standpoint. Yeah, now he's taking on the road show. No, and there's rumors that he's still worth, presumably.
Yeah. It seems like he might have had a second or third Bitcoin wallet that was not seized, and so he might have come out with a lot of wealth. Yeah, which would be fascinating. And
he was
I think,
forced to hold it.
Yeah. Ultimate hodler. And so Ross, now free, speaks across the U.S. about prison reform, cybersecurity, and the lessons of Silk Road, aiming to reshape his legacy in the libertarian movement. And he's pardoned and living under close public scrutiny, continues to champion libertarian advocacy. And prison rehabilitation efforts. So it'll be interesting to see once he actually does like the Joe Rogan style interview or the Lex Friedman, like the full story. I am interested to hear his side of this. I wonder.
I would be surprised if he doubles down and says I wasn't DPR.
That would be interesting.
Does
he
just
need
can't
to do that if he's been pardoned? He doesn't need to.
No, he doesn't need to do that. So if he does do that, that would be, and then he's able to prove like through some crazy thing, which I don't believe.
Yep.
The main thing, my main takeaway is this guy is a goated operator.
That's true.
Like clearly, like he benefited from some luck and timing and was like this missionary founder, but self-taught developer, first-time CEO, bootstrapped, 0 to $1 billion in sales. Very, very profitable the entire way, operating a remote team.
Yeah.
He clearly is very powerful.
In some ways,
he's got insane aura.
Yeah.
And if he uses that for good,
it could be very good.
It could be very good.
In some ways, he's playing the game on hard mode in the sense that, as you mentioned, he can't talk about people, he can't talk to anyone about his business. He can't, get, public investors or advisors or anything. But on the other side, he is selling the most addictive and product that just has immense pull from the market because it's illegal. And so I don't know how much credit you actually want to give him. Let's go through some more posts. We got Captain Nemo says Silk Road's historical importance is still underrated. I thought that was interesting from 2022. This is well before the pardon. And there's another post from Captain Nemo in here. 2022 says the ultimate tech anon moment was when Forbes did an interview with the Dread Pirate Roberts, the anonymous founder of Silk Road, at the height of Silk Road's ascent, when multiple federal agencies were trying and failing to track him down. That's so funny that he did an anonymous interview successfully with Forbes, because it's like now, Beth Bezos can't stay undoxed and like can't do an interview without getting doxed. And this guy was able to stay anonymous while appearing in Forbes.
One note, friend of the show, Lone Ranger says Donald Trump paved the way to the White House as a quote unquote convicted felon, giving Ross a clear path to a presidential run in the future. Ross, who turned 40 in prison, is now old enough to run for president and could be the first libertarian president if elected. So that's a stretch to me.
It's a joke, but it's one of those things where it's like maybe.
But oftentimes the most entertaining
outcome is the most likely. I agree.
And it does feel like not totally out of like if Ross's goal is to create a libertarian utopia, United States is awesome. It would be a great place to be a true utopia. And if that's what he believes, now he's got a few $100 million. He can finance a campaign.
I will be campaigning against him. That's all I can say.
Yeah.
We need law and order.
Law and order.
Captain Nemo continues and says, more recently, he posted this January 21st when Ross was pardoned. Hard to overstate how impactful it was to be a young, earnestly curious student when Ross Ulbricht was running Silk Road as the Dread Pirate Roberts, operating a completely illegal digital bazaar openly for years, despite every effort to stop it by the most powerful nation state ever. Massive Hansonian viewquake viscerally opened my eyes to technology's power to reshape existing power dynamics and sow the flow of history for better or worse. Yeah, and I think that's super interesting to think about how powerful the internet and this new technology was, that even though it was only 2 years and he did get shut down, he went on a generational run and was able to actually do this thing that no one else was able to do purely because of technology.
Crypto for a long time was looking for use cases outside of Bitcoin being digital gold, meme coins being speculation, and other activities. And the most obvious use case outside of digital gold that had the craziest product market fit was the Silk Road, right? But no crypto VC could be like, oh, look what's possible. Like this is the potential of crypto, because it was just like thousands of crimes being committed a day, like at scale. And it's funny because everybody that was, if all the people that had just been, committing crimes with BTC early days of Silk Road, if they had just bought and held, they'd all be millionaires because they'd be using like 20 Bitcoin to buy like a one pill. So that was like an expensive night on the town.
Yeah, the stories around Bitcoin have evolved so much. Like version 1 was this: we've used math to solve the general's problem, and it's going to be decentralized and not controlled by the government and perfectly anonymous. And then a lot of those stories kind of eroded, and it became just this crime money basically. And then it somehow made it through that and just became digital gold. And then there were new narratives around, oh, well, there'll be all these like games and metaverse built on top of it. And then that kind of melted away. And now it's prediction markets and meme coins and digital gold and just kind of a store of value. But it's interesting that at every point in time, there's been so many negative narratives about this is the worst thing ever, but there's been this one enduring narrative that's stuck with it and driven value, and now it's at 100K. It's like, it's crazy.
Well, yeah, and it's still, even though honest analysis of crypto technology, you could never say this isn't cool.
Exactly.
Like this isn't like this crazy, truly novel, transformative technology.
Yeah.
It's just that the primary case study was a nefarious use case, right?
Yep.
But it's still incredible that you could operate an open air drug bazaar online that anybody could go to and see, and law enforcement could see and not do anything about. Like that is a wild.
It was insane.
Wild. Situation.
And so let's go to Catherine Hahn, former GP at Andreessen Crypto, now with Hahn Ventures, and she is quoting I think the founder of Chainalysis, which is a company that does research into how crypto is used nefariously. Joni Levin says, "Today is my proudest day at Chainalysis. We enabled US, UK, Germany, and South Korea to take down one of the largest child abuse material sites. Law enforcement in 38 countries made 330 arrests of alleged pedophiles and rescued 23 children from abuse." And Catherine Hahn says, "Great work by Chainalysis and the authorities in such an important case. As I found when working on the Silk Road corrupt agent and other cases, having the digital breadcrumbs of crypto was a useful tool for law enforcement." And so she's actually saying that, like, the reason that she was able, I didn't know this, but I guess she worked on those corrupt agents in the Silk Road case. And the reason
the agents were obviously taking payment in Bitcoin.
Exactly. And so they were able to trace the Bitcoin, where it moved out of the Silk Road account into their account, and then was eventually taken off chain. And I think they were buying like sports cars and stuff. And so they were able to figure that out and track it down. And she was saying, like, if this was fiat, that would not have been possible. And so that's actually the exact opposite narrative that people were telling in crypto, but it's still worked out.
I don't know if she's saying it wasn't possible, but normally
much harder.
So if a corrupt agent takes a cash payment,
exactly,
there's not a record of that.
Yeah, the classic, like, you kick down the door, you've gotten the drug kingpin, and there's a huge stack of cash, a huge stack of cocaine, and then a bunch of luxury watches, and you're just like, throw the watches in the back.
One node.
Yeah. Oh yeah, we got a lot of cash and a lot of cocaine. I didn't see any gold bars there.
Yeah.
Throw it in the backpack. And like, you see this in like Training Day and like those like kind of cop movies. And there probably some element of truth, and a lot of good agents.
And it's wild. It shows,
don't do that.
It shows the fact that Catherine was working on this crazy high profile case. Yeah. Still recognize the potential of crypto, and goes on to have a $2 billion fund now. She was a GP
at Andreessen, really at a
historic run.
Yeah.
2021.
Coinbase and stuff. Fascinating.
So wild story.
So let's go to a promoted post. We're done with the Ross Ulbricht story. I hope you enjoyed it. We're moving on. We're going to go to the timeline, but first we got a promoted post from Josh Steinman promoting my product, the one I worked on with Jordy. He says, co-founder just texted me confirming that XL performs as promised. And XL, if you don't know, is a project, a little marketing stunt that Jordy and I worked on to deliver shareholder value. So it's a nicotine product. It says right.
And this was in many ways the genesis of TV, because we would.
This was the first loud opulence podcast.
Yeah, we would riff on what nicotine meant in the context of value creation, and that many of those early conversations sort of transformed into the show. So it's a cool physical.
Yeah, I mean, I think basically the first time we did anything that felt like this format was the launch video type of thing. We did a vibe reel, and then we did an hour sit down, and we both came into it being like, oh yeah, like let's just like riff on this and talk about what we did and
embodied
clip it.
Characters.
And we just were fully in character the whole time. And Ben, our vice president, was like, is Jordy an actor? like what was that? Yeah. And we were, there's some amazing quotes in there. It's fantastic. Yeah. We still have, that's a lost episode. We've never uploaded the full thing. It's like over an hour. We've only released like 3 clips.
I can't believe we recorded for an hour.
Oh yeah. We were just on fire. We were just locked in. Podcasters high. For sure.